Thank you so much for this invitation. So this is trying to take the counterpoint on two things that are pitted against each other as we try to figure out what the best course forward is. So, as Jeannie mentioned, we have some responsibilities outside of UHN proper, and so I wear a couple of hats. I'm a clinical hematologist and a laboratory hematologist, and this exposure has given me, some empathy on the rural community face of patient blood management as well, and how much of a gap we're facing there, as well as, of course, the incredible maw of blood use right at UHN. I'm a bit of an immunohematology hemovigilance nerd, and so that's going to be my perspective or my bias on this issue, because these are the folks who've compelled patient blood management for me. So maybe this is going to be a slightly different take than what you're used to. So this has been my research space instead, and it's been encouraged by Jeannie Callum, who was also the kind angel who invited me to give this talk. Thank you. And this amazing transfusion medicine family that I get to work with across the U of T and Queens and CBS system. And greater alliances have been forged with the McMaster Group too. So this amalgamation, CTTG, has been positioned in really important clinical trials, specifically addressing hemostasis and how we can do this better. So I'm actually removed from this, so I have no conflicts with respect to fibers, FAIRs, and FIRST, but I think this stuff is also very germane to patient blood management, as some of these results so far have shown. So I also don't have conflicts with industry other than begging for the occasional compassionate access rescue medication for my immunocatastrophic patients. And so, if anything, I have a negative bias with pharma, and I apologize for that. But really, I think that the people who've given me perspective on this are my patients and my peers. And you will not meet anyone who approximates a Jehovah's Witness like a transfusion medicine physician, because we see the harms, we deal with constraints and shortages. Any one of us who had major blood loss or anemia, you ask us how low we let our hemoglobins go before we agreed to transfusion. So that should tell you something. My patients have taught me so much, and I'm very much and with full respect indebted to my Jehovah's Witness patients, who I find incredibly inspiring. I haven't converted yet, but it could happen in theory. So, as I said, I'm sort of here on the left in this austerity fringe. So the under-transfusion of the lows is sort of the scary thing that I'm facing, the people who simply can't get transfused. So people who renounce blood for religious reasons, those with commanding antibodies, rare blood types, multi-allo-immunized. The people with antibodies who have severe reactions are patients with sickle cell who have hyperhemolysis, some of whom are seronegative. I mean, the cross matches look completely clean, and yet every time they get an exposure, they're in the ICU taking millions of dollars in immune control therapy if they make it. So with the rare types, hard needs, this includes people with IgA deficiency who are counter-sensitized to IgA, who have recurrent anaphylaxis when they get blood exposed. We're trying to get these people into transplants, and so we're doing really extreme patient blood management. So, I think where my own position of neglect has been is that anemic or hematinic deficit unoptimized at-risk masses in the middle. And of course, the arguments or negotiations we engage with for the highs on highs, where people are trying to give blood liberally to people on the other end of the healthy enough curve. So my objectives, as Katerina mentioned, she was given objectives. These were mine, and I thought, okay, this is cool. We have to understand the risks associated with blood transfusions in 2024, and this is a big update year. As well as describe the risks with PBM strategies. And you're thinking, what could those be other than, what Katerina had mentioned with EPO perhaps. So I'm just going to give you the punchline first. You can sleep for the rest of the session, but blood items have gotten safer, though more expensive in the process, which is another kind of call to arms then to handle this stuff carefully. And patient blood management is a win-win-win. But that's easier said than done. And so the real challenge here is having absorbed this message, implementing it. So I thought I would take like an S-bar approach, because that's how all of our emails run to us now. The situation is the need. The background is going to be to talk about the cons of each of these two things facing each other. I'm going to give you my assessment with some concerns and examples, as well as recommend some next steps. So yes, PBM is a need, implementation is challenging, and there are many forces or traditions that resist change. And I don't know about you guys, but us in the blood bank, we're getting emails almost constantly. Like, we're almost just insensitized to them now. There's constantly these National Emergency Blood Management Committee meetings and notices for inventory advisories, green, amber phase, platelets, red cells, of various types, you name it. And so we've kind of just gotten almost used to this, which is sad. And in the background, the trends on donors are not good. And so young people, for whatever reason, are decreasing in their willingness to donate. And it's the old people that are getting more rigorous about it, and yet they're going to be the ones using our blood products. And so is this going to be sustainable? We don't know. And, as I mentioned, my emphasis has been on those for whom blood is contraindicated immunologically, but hemovigilance reasons, et cetera, and those who for religious reasons decline. But I think another thing for us to think about is sort of the global bioethics of responsible blood management. The world is erupting in so much war right now, and the last time I looked at the number of displaced individuals, we're at 120 million people. This means people who don't have health care, people who don't have good blood access. This is a picture of a fridge in Kampala, Uganda, where I did immunohematology type research on ABO relationships with malaria. This is a blood fridge in a very high volume hospital. And then, the pandemic hits and we discover a whole new population that needs patient blood management, and it's the people who fell prey to misinformation, the pharma cynics, the libertarians, the vaccine skeptics. And really, patient blood management is for everyone. And I think Katarina's point on this having to be an equitable process means it's everyone. It doesn't matter who you are, but of course some people need it a little more than others. So this is what UHN blood utilization looked like last year, and our blood utilization is increasing. It is interesting, it's commensurate with the number of patients that we're serving, and in fact, I was a little alarmed when we saw a 20% increase in our platelet use because, our platelet bags have gotten a little smaller with the pathogen inactivation. But I was relieved to see that the number of patients we're giving platelets to also grew by the same amount. So it's not that we're just dumping ineffectual platelets ad infinitum into the same or a smaller number of people. So, we're serving more people, which is also a bit concerning because, they have blood needs. And if we gauge on Toronto General in particular, which is where my office sits and where we have a lot of blood use, Toronto General uses up the 65% of UHN's blood use. A lot of it is from the ORs, and so this is meant to be an OR-focused session. About 7 to 10% of our red cell use at Toronto General is in the OR, and about 10 to 12% of our platelet use is in the Toronto General OR. So that represents something that could potentially shift, and this may not show up so well, but in the OR you can also see that we trigger somewhat liberally. So only about a third of the time do we trigger at sub 80. The majority of our patients, they're in OR, hemoglobin triggers are running in the 90s. So that's something that will maybe need some improvement. In addition, these are the reactions that we generate at UHN. So we have some days where we're investigating 5 to 7 consults. We had several days with 4 events, and some of these are terrible. So our reaction rate is also increasing with the increased use of blood, no surprise. And that also gives us a lot of work because some of these people in the process discover that they are untransfusible hence. So for a little more in background, so risks of transfusion, this is my space. So this is a secular focus. you can kind of divide this into two key categories. The ones that we kind of all know about and get trained on because they're hemovigilance grade level events, the stuff that we have to report, so the so-called deterministic or direct harms. And you can subclassify those in a severity or frequency hierarchy, and that's a helpful construct when you try to give consent. There's the temporal presentation archetypes, which is sort of, when you're, working on the floor, trying to figure out what you're seeing for the sake of management. And then there's also the issue of by item and the nature of the product plus or minus the nature of the patient. And this is where we personalize or understand what specifically a person might be facing. There's this very interesting realm of probabilistic or indirect harms, and this comes from observational data, big data insights. So something as simple as underperformance evidence, like why is it that when you get a red cell transfusion, it doesn't recapitulate all the advantages of someone who's naturally at that hemoglobin? That's a little weird. So the signal that this is an additive harm among other things when people do regression analyses. There's something going on here. There's some badness with transfusion, and of course there's all kinds of statistical hazards with over-interpreting, but I will get into that. Finally, though, there are some theoretical or emerging hazards, and we're getting into that game. Thank goodness COVID was not transfusion transmissible, but in early days we were very worried about that, and so it was really a matter of time. It still is, and I think that's what helped drive CBS to want to nail these components with pathogen reduction. So, in terms of the flow of odds of bad things happening, you can kind of follow this 90-10 rule. So, 1 to 10% of our sittings will have a complication. And thankfully, the majority of them are going to be minor. And thankfully, the infectious risks that were the substance of the Creever Commission of Inquiry into the Tainted Global Blood Tragedy, those have collapsed. We've invested a tremendous amount of money to mitigate that. And so what's left over from our reactions, a minority of them are severe. And really these are non-infectious hazards, again in a 90-10 proportion between the quantitatively rooted, kind of dangerous doctor volume overload scenario versus everything else that's kind of a little more qualitative and not always dose dependent, so immunoinflammatory events even at low levels. So I like to use, I'm obsessed with the number 3. I like to organize things in 3 and then pack 3s within them. So, when I talk to patients and get consent, I talk about 3 key tiers, and these are kind of frequency aligned, the stuff that happens commonly in the 1 to 10% range, the stuff that happens super rare, 1 in a million times, and then the stuff that happens in the middle group, so 1 in 1,000 to 1 in 100,000. So, the minor things are, the fevers that you can medicate, the FNHTRs, the minor allergic reactions, and then seroconversions. They're not instantaneous. These can take a few weeks or months, but that's relevant to someone who might plan to have a pregnancy or plan to have a transplant, because these things can bother those outcomes. In the middle tier, second letter of the alphabet, the letter B, are the 3 Bs. So breathing trouble, bacterial contamination, and a botched process or human error. The breathing trouble I kind of lift up into category 1 because technically TACO is really that frequent. It's properly recognized in the 1 to 10% range and not in the passive hemovigilance quotes of 1 in 1,000 or less. So we want to acknowledge that. And then, when you have a consent discussion, you kind of round out with some confidence with the super rare stuff, because after you've scared the bejesus out of the patient, you still want to earn their trust on giving them blood if they really need it. So yeah, we've dealt with the stuff at the bottom, and if we remember the patient's special instructions, hopefully we don't give them GVHD by failing to irradiate the cellular products if they have that indication. So, you can also divide, as I said, by archetype. So, there's the acute and the delayed, again, some 3s. So the acute reactions are really in these 3 realms, the febriles, the allergics, and the cardiorespiratory. So earth, wind, and fire, if you will. Some of them more serious or actionable and process influential hereafter if you discover something from that investigation. And then for the delayeds, you can just kind of think of your CBC. So hemolytic reactions on the red cell front, platelet transfusion refractoriness, or the platelet equivalent of hyperhemolysis and PTP. And then if you think of the white cell or incorporate the whole hemogram, the possibility of transfusion-associated graft versus host disease. And so these things tend to show up on lab results, or this is what might trigger an investigation as we figure out what kind of harm occurred singularly or cumulatively in this patient. So the other way to think about reactions is just to put the products against each other and think about, okay, what are they made of? Are they mostly plasma, mostly cells, or a mingling of both? And platelets have it bad because they're stacked both ways, and so you can see that their risks historically exceed those on anything on either end. So you'd have the bacon risk from warm storage, allergy risk, FNHTR, all of those storage-related humors from the room temperature, inventory of this stuff. And of course, cellular products, GVHD risk, these are the things that needed irradiation. Plasma, you don't worry about that. Cells shatter when you freeze thaw, so that's kind of auto-mitigated. But, what do? We pre-medicate, we diurese, and we irradiate. And some of this stuff is better evidence-based than others. Enter 2023, 2024, we now have benefits of pathogen reduction. Amazing. The problem is it only covers 2 of these 3 things, and the majority of our activity is on red cells. So, red cells still constitute, 2/3 of our dispensation activity. But I'm not complaining because our plasma and our platelets are now much risk reduced. So if you just compare all of those pluses in the involvement columns, they are different. And the risk of bacon has essentially vanished with the Sorelins treatment. And the pooled platelets are in smaller volumes, so hopefully even taco risk has gone down. And you can see that I don't have those pre-medication bubbles here anymore, or if we have them, we're going to shift them to the right towards the red cells. So 2024 was an exciting year as well because the 46th blood group antigen system was discovered. There's a lot of noise on the red cell surface. We have a lot of diversity here, and we don't even know the full extent of what's immunogenic or what could incite antibodies. And it's on this 2 or 3 cell screen that we think we're going to detect every antibody that a person might have that could explain a hemolytic transfusion reaction. So just to appreciate that every group and screen is very fallible because it can't possibly pick up on every antibody your patient could have against anything they've ever seen before. And every ABO RHD matched blood is a guaranteed liquid mismatched transplant at hundreds of other levels. And this is why we do these repeated groups and screens to prepare the patient for the next eventuality, which sometimes is being screened positive and now facing a delayed transfusion, depending on how hard it is to get antigen bypassing units. So, it's very interesting, as I mentioned, we put blood into people and their mortality doesn't go down. It might stay the same if we're lucky, and then in some subgroups it might even worsen. So that's scary. What's wrong with what we're giving to people? And so the idea here is that, transfusion above a certain threshold may be bad for you, and then the question is why? Like, why else other than the reactions? Because it's not the reactions that are driving this difference. Or anemia. If you hack with nature, okay, if you try to override what nature has done in the adaptation to anemia, maybe that's also bad for the patient. So this is very humbling, and we want to respect adaptation and not short circuit it. So one of the ideas was that the reason that blood transfusion is bad for you is maybe it's just gross. Maybe there's a storage lesion, and I summarize this as the 4 S's. So long stored blood is stiffer, it gets ATP depleted. It needs ATP to be able to squeeze through capillaries narrower than its own diameter. And so, red cells in a temporary state of rigor mortis are shunting. Red cells that have been stored are stickier, and so they cytoadhere almost sickle cell style. They are 2,3-DPG depleted, and so for the first 24 hours in vivo, they're not offloading as much oxygen, and then there's this other biochemical phenomenon of S-nitrosohemoglobin reduction, and so you've got this messed up nitric oxide relationship, and the sabotaging supernatant stew, sorry for all the S's, but that's all the inflammatory stuff. So, there's more than enough here to kind of worry about. And What's interesting about all of this biomechanical, biochemical interplay is that a load of research was done to figure out just how bad this was. And it didn't really yield a lot. So the observational data were very different from the RCTs, but we took an interest in this by thinking, okay, if a red cell unit's function is to increase your DO2 crit for cellular utilization's sake, if you're giving someone who is so profoundly anemic that they're hyperlactatemia, they spun out of Krebs cycle, they're in a state of mitochondrial asphyxia. If you've got long stored blood versus fresh blood, and they have differential properties in restoring oxygenation, well, then maybe we'll see a difference in lactate clearance when you're giving a sizable load of blood to someone with profound anemia. And the people with the most profound anemia who are walking around are kids with malaria in sub-Saharan Africa. And so in Uganda, they have a 35-day storage time, and we looked at the extreme opposites. There's no overlap here, the first 10 days versus the last 10 days of storage. And we tested this. We were very worried, by the way, that with all of the storage research, it would be found that long stored blood is bad, and boy, that would be really bad for an already short blood supply. But thankfully, what this showed, and these were kids who had to have hemoglobins of sub 50 with elevated lactate levels to enroll. Their doses of red cell input were about 1/3 of their blood circulation. So this was if we're interested in dose dependence or dose response for causality, this is the physiologic model of interest. No difference in lactate clearance. So that was reassuring, which made us kind of stand back and think, okay, well, maybe it's not the storage lesion after all. But then you've got everything everywhere all at once with every single bad outcome you could possibly imagine when you look at observational research. Like everything is there. And so, there's thrombosis signals. So Ruchika Goel was looking at, 750,000 surgical admissions and the VTE odds, and found that you basically doubled your odds of a DVT or a PE if you had a transfused surgical admission, even when you're correcting for things. And then, in this REDS2 medical twist on the same idea, Gustav Edgren spun the same question. This group found no impact when you adjusted for differences. So where does the truth lie? This interesting paper was looking at restrictive blood transfusion strategies from existing liberal versus restrictive trigger trials. And here a signal was found in a systematic review. So maybe this is a contributor or an increased risk. But really, there's just multifarious badness by association, and it's almost just too much to articulate. But if you look at critical care studies, very little benefit when you stack all of the transfusion outcomes against each other. 2.3 million transfusion-involved admissions in 1,000 hospitals, the death odds going up and infection odds going up, increased length of stay. And then in this Trentino paper, so 61,000 surgeries at teaching hospitals. Transfusing at greater than 90 triples the risk of dying. Transfusing at every hemoglobin above 60 increases lengths of stay even if it doesn't kill you. And no ascertained point of transfusion being beneficial. Weird. Okay, 20 years. This paper just came out, I think just a few days or weeks ago. 48,000 patients, double bad if you get blood versus not. So all-cause mortality and cardiovascular mortality. So, how do we take this with a big grain of salt? Well, major problems with observational studies. There's always going to be confounders. There's always going to be selection bias and reverse causation, no matter how much you do to correct for these things. But this paper scared our pants off this year. So the cerebral amyloid angiopathy publication, again, Gustav Edgren, and he's the guy who basically refutes everything that you worry about. So he comes out and publishes this paper that says, that if you're unlucky enough to have an exposure to that 1 in 1,000 odds of a blood donor who is destined at some point to have multiple intracranial bleeds from cerebral amyloid angiopathy, you yourself as a recipient have 2 to 3 times increased odds of the same kind of brain bleeds. And not after 30 years of the usual latency time for cerebral angiopathy, but half of those events within 5 years after your transfusion. Okay, so that is scary, and this is not anything we're talking about on our consent forms. So even if you ask someone just about this one thing, I mean, I personally never want to get transfused, like let me go down to 40, So here, then we get all of this news all the time. What's the next bug in our blood supply, and is it transfusion transmissible? Who knows? But wherever you go in the world, there's guaranteed to be something awful or rotten in your unit. And then, the world is, very polluted. And so our donors bring those pollutants into us, even if you buy organic apples. So, this is, another concern, and these toxins get measured, when you look at firefighters who we're always doing blood draws on, they're loaded with PFAS and all of these interesting chemicals. So, whose blood do we want anymore? RCTs to the rescue. So, Katerina mentioned this. So, at least in the perspective of this RCT, we calm down, because mortality is the same, whether you're liberal or conservative. So at least here, you're not seeing harms of liberalism, even though all those observational studies suggest you have that. But what's really important, if you believe in equivalency, if you're at least settled that, okay, I'm not going to kill my patient if I transfuse them, you have to look at the fact that you're just using so much more blood, and blood is such a limited resource. And here's the other thing. So, if you feel blood is too safe, there's risk compensation theory, and you become prone to its overuse. So this is a phenomenon, and this has been demonstrated, and it's possible that the skeptics of patient blood management are the ones who just don't believe that this stuff is unsafe because they haven't sat down with these papers or talked to one of us. The costs increasing. So if you look at the blue and the green line, those are the items that we're now pathogen inactivating. And this doesn't even show the full increase in cost, because in 2023, it was just a phase-in for the Buffy Coat pool, so we went live in November. The apheresis platelets weren't fully pathogen reduced until May of 2024. So it won't be until next year that we see the full cost increase of each of our platelets that are modified. But as you can see, the red cells, which are left unmodified, are cost stable. And of course, this doesn't include activity-based cost. So what about the risks of PBM? So, Katerina also showed this matrix. And, we go through these release of liability forms with our Jehovah's Witnesses, and you can see that some of the stuff is, some of it is a little scary. We've used hemoglobin-based oxygen carriers a few times, and some of the stuff is just not routine care. We don't offer this for every patient blood management case. And so it really depends on what you're doing as the blood substitute to frame your risk. And, our preoperative anemias are common, and so if this is the general estimate, it means we actually have a big potential impact to have. And of course, this is going to depend on your population and how much lead time you have to correct the issue. And so you're going to face some challenges. If you're dealing with a very sick older population with anemia of chronic disease that doesn't budge much, or they've got MDS, but no one had the time to do the marrow to establish that fact, there's going to be limitations to how much you do, no matter how much you throw patient blood management-wise to a patient. And so these are the key risks. So, if you overmanage and you leave the patient under-transfused, your DO2 may be insufficient for your cellular needs. You may delay the patient's procedures because, you're obsessed with correcting that hemoglobin. There's a lot of unacknowledged or uncounted for staff time. We talked about how much we have not counted or valued that patient's return to their usual life, but what about all those conferences or time away from other kinds of care just to figure out how to optimize this case? I know that a Jehovah's Witness going for a lung transplant assembles a lot of our resources and time. With clotting and bleeding, you could potentially allow your patient to clot too much if you fiddle with this too much or pull back too much on their thromboprophylaxis. Or if it's a Jehovah's Witness and they don't want any of these hemostatic agents, or the ones that are non-blood-based aren't working, you may end up with refractory bleeding. And there are some problems with the alternatives, so the acquisition costs for some of your technologies and the adverse events associated with them. Our Jehovah's Witnesses have taught us a lot, and these are phenomena that we would never ethically be able to gain were it not for their own sacrifice. So we know at what hemoglobin levels people have MIs or when they die or what the median survival is in different ranges, and this informs our conversations when we plug back in with the patients, and hopefully alone, because they may change their mind and not have coercive presence in the room. But what's really at stake as we fiddle with triggering lower is our concern on brain and heart. So are we going to oxygenate enough? Yeah, we've got a lot of reserve in hemoglobin. We only use about a quarter of it, but if you're already at a quarter of your red cell biomass and the brain is used to extracting 1/3 and the heart 2/3, you're going to be in some trouble in basic math. So, the under-transfusion fears really blew up in the context of AMI with the secondary analysis of Carson and Mint. So, some have likened this to the impact of dual antiplatelet agents. If this delta in mortality or adverse outcomes, the risk ratio is truly this significant for going liberal, then maybe this is something we need to do. This opposes what the precursor reality Ducrot trial showed, although that was only like 1/5 of the patient enrollments of this particular trial. But what you'll see also, the price of going liberal is TACO. That's the one thing that did slip out as the price of going liberal. The other concern in the OR is the fallibility of the readouts. And so, there's, especially if you're pulling back on not oversaline, resuscitating your patient, if you've bled out most of your biomass and you do a capillary blood hemoglobin level, it's going to look normal. So that hemoglobin level may not truly reflect what that patient has within them. And so judging too much on what the hemoglobin is in the OR is somewhat unfair. And so I also have some nervousness about tying people to a using blood wisely trigger of 80 in some context, because that doesn't really tell you what the patient's at. And of course, the patient can't tell you how symptomatic they are when they're asleep. But it is interesting that we have some reassurances that in upper GI bleed, less was more. Like if we fill them up too much, maybe their varix opens up and they break their clot open. TRIX3 was also another study of reassurance. So physiologically, you can fiddle around with decreasing your patient's oxygen utilization, but Jeannie and I had this email conversation a couple of weeks ago. If hypothermia is good for your patient to decrease their cellular oxygen utilization, what is the price of that with coagulation when we're so obsessed with warming them up to deal with their bleed? I mean, some of these things oppose each other, and so how do you pick a side? With increasing your oxygen delivery, oxygen also has its own toxicities, and it's going to depend on the disease, and so we don't know all those details yet. And who's got a hyperbaric oxygen chamber? So, do we accept these patients in critical if they are Jehovah's Witnesses? And the answer that we've had is yes. We've not had our hands on bovine cell-free hemoglobin for a while, but we've used it in about 4 patients, and only one had a good outcome, and I think she was underdosed, which is why. But the meta-analysis here, which associated with the downfall of many of these manufacturers, or rising like a phoenix from the flames from one of the companies, it's not positive, and so there's impaired nitric oxide bioavailability from having hemoglobin outside of a membrane, which was never meant to be. The oxygen toxicities and all, issues with DAMPs and inflammation and methemoglobinemia. So very scary. Intraoperative cell salvage. We would love it if everybody had this, but are we aware of our risk events with these? It would be wrong of me to say that this stuff never happens. I mean, I've seen life-threatening hemolysis on a dialysis circuit, so sometimes bad things happen there too. And hemostasis, lots of things to fiddle with. Tranexamic acid, great, but there was a time where we once used recombinant factor 7A quite a lot. Thankfully, that came down, but we can overdo it in this effort of patient blood management. So for some assessment, some concerns and examples. Yes, so anyway, a little bit of a sinusoid. So blood transfusion really exploded after World War II. Then it collapsed after the tainted global blood tragedy. Then, utilization shot back up again, and maybe we're now entering enlightened times because we've had struggles. We're beginning to appreciate that, there are some toxicities that we didn't realized before. As Katerina had mentioned as well, patient blood management seems to really satisfy everything that our business intelligence people care about. So mortality, complications, readmissions, length of stay. Boy, did that matter in the pandemic, where every single hospital bed day was so critical. I mean, everybody was getting vaccinated just to protect those ICU beds, even if it made them uncomfortable. Costs. So I've also wondered, like, when do we give Jehovah's Witnesses their tax credit? No inferiority signal for untransfused people, and when they have this saved life discharge, just think of how many units they saved us. So, thank you, Jehovah's Witnesses. Another question that's come up in my mind is, salutogenic confounding with Jehovah's Witnesses too. So, do they do better in bloodless representation because blood is bad? Or are they healthier than the average person who accepts transfusion? These are people whose lifestyles are very focused on integrated health and community, which is something that we all lack in social media, mental rupture times. There's no studies yet to compare an interesting contrast population, which is the anti-vaxxers. So what would their outcomes be if you pitted them against Jehovah's Witnesses? We don't know. So I don't know why their literature makes PBM maybe look better than it actually is. So we have to appreciate that the Jehovah's Witnesses are different people. They're very organized, they work with everyone in the hospital, they develop the alternatives, and they have their better outcomes. And then there was this really interesting Trentino paper. I urge you guys to look at it, but boy, exclusion patterns in study designs influencing whether restrictive or liberal arms look better than each other. Mind blown, which is to say that maybe larger dose inputs associating with a greater effect size, i.e. maybe the MINT trial had its apparent advantage due to the permissive design of that particular study. So we have to maybe get deep in the roots to understand why we're having a signal sometimes of restrictive looking better than liberal. So other concerns, many moving parts with PBM. Who's going to do it? Constantly making cuts meanwhile. Cut your budget here. Stop doing this. TIS has just been cut. 27 years after the Creever Commission, our national hemovigilance system is all but sunsetting by April 2026. Okay, shocker. I'm devastated. I need counseling for this. So if TIS has been cut, what hope is there? Do we think they're going to throw money at this? But Katerina and others have shown again and again how much you get back from this. So 7.7 times the initial costs saved back from your attempts at constraining in the name of patient blood management. So 10 and 20-year checks, her papers here. So the right hand doesn't always know what the left hand is doing. And it's very interesting in our hospitals, transfusion remains an activity-based cost. All we see are the administrative shadows and not the acquisition, because hospitals don't have to pay for the blood that we bring in for the patients, which means it is an incentive for the hospital to just sit back and let transfusions happen, because if the alternative is bringing in IV iron, which is expensive for our pharmacy, everyone's going to look away. So yes, it's cheaper for the taxpayer at large. There may be a perception of greater cost to the hospital to use unfunded alternatives. I saw the Hungarian movie Semmelweis on the weekend. It was the Hungarian Film Festival. I'm Hungarian. And this was an interesting film on belief perseverance. So this guy ended up in a mental asylum. He was serially discredited. He was trying to save the lives of septic parturients by using bleach as a decontamination measure as you went from autopsies to birthing suites. And he figured out germ theory years before the French got credit for it. So he had overwhelming evidence, but it was very interesting. What people didn't want to accept in him was the implication that gentlemen's hands were therefore filthy, because the idea was that someone who's that medically educated can't be as unclean as a person on the street. I mean, women were preferring to give birth in the alleys rather than come into the healthcare facility. So he got committed into an insane asylum. He got beaten up by his guards. He died of sepsis, ironically, at the age of 47. But this inspired an interesting kind of disruptive work in psychiatry on the invincible social power of false truths and how they also make people go crazy. So all of us in transfusion medicine, we're all going a little crazy. crazy because no one's believing this message. And yes, it's transgressive, it's subversive. And then the other thing to appreciate, like, okay, we're in woke times, and it's legit because it's interesting. You see that we transfuse blacks differently from how we transfuse whites. We see unacceptable differences in maternal mortality rate for black women versus others. But what's very interesting about that deprivation for blacks is that it spins into the inadvertently beneficial side, in that case at least. So, an anti-PBM anecdote, I don't want to say that PBM is like the solution to everything, but we did have an interesting case of a high prevalence antibody, hereditary hemorrhagic telangiectasia, bleeding all the time, severe acute hemolytic reaction. We did this monocyte monolayer assay to see if this antibody was still hemolysis predicting, and it wasn't. And she basically ran out of the whole country's YTA negative blood supply, and she said, you know what, I've had enough with patient blood management. I am so fatigued, I'm so symptomatic, please give me blood. And she was the happiest person you've ever met once we crossed that barrier and gave her blood. The other interesting thing too, anti-Stratus style, is we were drawing blood into tubes that were too small for the blood bank to even be able to use them because she was needing so many cross matches, and we don't just have like an analyzer, dip a little probe in and create digits. Like we've got our gloves on and we're mingling red cells with plasma. So the exception to Stratus has to be a blood bank sample where you may be cross-matching a lot of material. And that sample is not like a labile thing that is no longer relevant 6 hours later like an electrolyte. This is something that's going to represent your patient for 3 days to a month. So sometimes you want chunkiness here. I love this quote, easier to ask for forgiveness than permission. I've tried to see what we can do at UHN with promoting like screensavers, desktop, wallpapers, blood, best practice advisories, and epic builds. No, like you have to go through the craziest qualification process. Meanwhile, at our other hospitals, they're like, yeah, you can put anything on the computer splash. So, this exposure experience has shown me just how culturally different each hospital can be. Okay, last point here. I know I've gone over time here, but recommendations. So your people, so low-hanging fruit, your peers, your education, patients, activists, advocates. We have some very interesting business intelligence dashboards being built now where we can start to look in this more ambient way at utilization based on practitioner time, the category of involvement. We have to respond to our critics. We had a damning report from Cancer Care Ontario on our red cell use and albumin use in oncologic surgery. So, this is part of our whole feedback. This is a mindset change, and it's in the eye of the beholder. So what might seem like expropriation, denying your patient blood, is actually an act of love, of advocacy. So administering less, giving more iron, feed what works at the best benefit-risk advantage. And thank God for Raise the Bar, Menaka Pai, Michelle Scholzberg, working tirelessly for years to change our reference concept of iron deficiency. Maybe this will change how many patients show up in our surgical clinics with iron deficiency anemia. I hope so. But let me finish with this very upsetting story. One of our client site hospitals, we had a woman coming in with severe menorrhagic anemia, iron deficient. She had a transfusion reaction, which is why I was investigating her. She ended up getting iron. She shows up 3 months later, again, iron deficient, no family doctor. She turned to crack cocaine on the street for her energy. It was easier for her to get crack cocaine on the street. This was not a previous drug user. It was easier for her to get crack cocaine than to have a family doctor. She didn't have one. And anyone who was willing to go through the Byzantine process of filling out paperwork for parenteral iron coverage. So we need to do better, and this is a bigger problem than peri-op and pre-op. So who picks up the pieces? Studies looking at, you've recognized iron deficiency anemia, still not fixed, same as this lady. And disappointingly, just as PBM got denigrated as not being valuable enough, The USPTF says not strong enough evidence to get women iron replete for their pregnancy. So research options, we've got to clean up the mess of understanding the signals from our observational studies. We need real smarties, and thankfully we've got Dr. Raza trying to figure out how to analyze the big data that we're sitting on here in Canada, because it's a lot and we're probably going to gain some insights. And as Katerina showed, all of these things, they confound each other, but they're each important in their own right. And so we have to understand how to dissect this to figure out what our priorities are. And as I said, the global supply is at stake. This is an ethical issue. And it's soul destroying for, some of our own peers, these authors, telling us that 88% of what you do is useless. So instead of doing something useless, let's do something useful. So to conclude, the risk of PBM versus risk of transfusion is an absurd comparison. The core of PBM is not risky. It's rational, risk-based decision-making, and done right. It's a simple optimization option for patient outcomes of importance, how they feel, how they survive, and stewardship of larger system resources. Transfusion we know is risky, maybe less so these days now that we've got pathogen-reduced items, but red cells still not the case. So this is your choice. We can iron optimize, but we know it's hard, okay? Many of us look away because we just don't have the time, we don't have the system support. So that's not the right thing to do. So what do we do next? So at the individual level, identify the questions that we need for their context to come up with their best personalized answer. And at a systems level, we need I love that tile picture of Katerina's. Like, this takes a lot of people. But if it's advocacy, petitions, pilots, business plans, hospital transfusion committees, SOPs, clinical policies, we need to turn this into action. And I know that the PBM people here put out this really cool tool, but thank you for listening and for allowing me to go over time.